Fantasy and horror fiction have the remarkable opportunity of blending all of the things that make us existentially cry out in the middle of the night into the endless night sky and condense them all into one giant unfathomable entity that inspires nothing but terror and fear. Well, I mean, religion and mythology also do that, but the point is, literature is a blank canvas in what can be imagined through the confines of the human mind, be it an eternal old god with a billion eyes lurking behind entire constellations, or a robed figure who walks behind the rose of the apocalypse, puppeteering humanity just for the sake of it, really. And in that case, let's find out exactly what they've got in store. Hello horror fans, what's going on, and once again welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, top 5 scary videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today we curiously take a look at the top 5 most terrifying gods in literature. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that scene was from 2016's A Dark Song, a remarkable movie that's been covered here several times, and one that also features some of the same themes that we'll be laying out with this list. Give it a watch if you haven't seen it. Also, as is the case with our similar list, there'll be no Lovecraft or Stephen King featured here, as we already have numerous compilations of their own exclusive gods. So if that's what you're hankering for, then take a look after this video, of course. Anyway, on with the show. Kicking off at number 5, TASH, Chronicles of Narnia. And no, not Natasha, but TASH. TASH the inexorable, TASH the irresistible, the patron god of the ruling class of Calaman, essentially the best friend and overseer of the rich, who gobbles up poor people and the working class just for the sheer fun of it, to further fuel his dark and manipulative reign. Now, if you know anything about C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, then you'll certainly know that this particular fantasy series draws its main body of inspiration from the Judeo-Christian religion. And whereas the bold and brave lion himself, Aslan, represents Jesus, while as you may imagine, Tash represents the pure and evil antithesis of that, the Antichrist. And yes, say what you will about the Chronicles of Narnia, and whether you think it's tame or not comparable to some later fiction found here, the truth of the matter is Tash is pretty damn terrifying, and he's the purveyor of some pretty horrendous themes throughout the series of what is essentially a children's novel. Tash appears as a dark and shadowy demon, an almost skeletal figure of a humanoid body with a vulture-like head and 4 grotesque taloned arms. His presence is said to bring with it the cold, and his stench is that of death. And yet, whilst many people in the world of Narnia refuse to believe in Tash, he is very much a real and evil entity. Now, strangely enough, although being the pure antithesis of Aslan, one of Narnia's most prolific figures, Tash appears only twice in this series, and in 1954's The Horse and His Boy, and in 1956's The Last Battle. In the former, he's referred to in the same passage as 2 other gods, Azeroth, where have we heard that name before, and Zardina, the Lady of the Night and the Maidens. And yet still, comparable to those two, Tash is still the only figure that the fanatical people of Calaman would like to sacrifice children to in his name. Yeah, that's pretty much the extent of it, really. At one point, the followers of Tash tried to run a smear campaign against Aslan by suggesting that Tash and Aslan were the same entity, conveniently called Tashlan. Yeah, obviously they didn't buy the fact, given the fact that Tash is very clearly a giant, terrifying, bird-headed primeval straight from some Assyrian cultist mythology. Hey, it was a simpler time. Swinging in at number 4, Despair, the Sandman. And you know what? We could have certainly featured the actual main character of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman on this list, the dream-sleeping, swagger-walking, chain-smoking, coffee fiend himself, Dream, aka Morpheus if you're feeling adventurous. Because as a side note, for a protagonist, Dream does some pretty messed up stuff in that brilliant graphic novel series, and kind of ends his reign by just killing everyone. Sort of. He certainly commits a few murders along the way, but whatever. For the sake of brevity, we'll give Dream the benefit of the doubt, and instead we'll cast our gaze toward his equally perplexing and utterly bone-chilling counterpart, Despair. One of them, anyway. As is written in Endless Nights, the follow-up to the Sandman series, and one that fully fleshes out the pantheon of the endless, take away the despair and there is nothing left. Nothing but an empty room and a hook of the perfect shape and size for snagging at your heart. Despair most often appears as a short, naked, grey and rotund woman with sharp, pointed teeth and greasy black hair tied in a bun. She demonstrates no odour, but allegedly her shadow has often been described as smelling musky and pungent like the skin of a snake. Her sigil is a hooked ring which she only wears on her left hand and haphazardly uses it to tear into her own flesh absentmindedly, which, yeah, that's one of the reasons she's making this list, really. You see, in Despair's realm, in stark comparison to the wild and whimsical realm of the dreaming that Morpheus rules over, is instead a grey and foggy space filled with endless, skittering rats and mirrors used for looking upon people in the depths of their own despair. You see, what is strange is that Despair is said to be one of the few endless that have seen 2 incarnations constellations. It isn't clear as to how she was initially destroyed and reformed, but this one is certainly a bleak and bewildering replacement. Compared to all of the other endless who are clear in their emotional personifications, despair is a tough one to handle. Next up at number 3, Morgoth, the Lord of the Rings. Of course, we can't really talk about terrifying godlike entities in fantasy and horror fiction without first addressing perhaps the OG of Dark Lords of fantasy incarnate, Morgoth Bauglir, or Melkor, depending on which point in his life you familiarise yourself with him, because as we all know, even Dark Lords of Chaos and Shadow have a story, and we should respect that, even if it is full of betrayal and terror and evil of all sorts of machinations. Now, if you know anything about the vast and flowing mythology penned by Tolkien in both The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, as well as many other works of fiction, then you'll know that Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of all things Ea and Arda included, also created the entities of the Aina to live within it. In the void of nothingness, he gave life to these angelic beings, and Melkor was the most powerful of them all. However, dissatisfied that Eru had abandoned the void, Melkor grew curious enough to seek to emulate his own creator in an attempt to fill the void with sentient beings. For this though, Melkor would need the secret fire, and that was impossible for him to find. To combat that, Melkor sought to create his own discordant melodies in the music of the Aina, the fabric of creation that forms the basis for the themes of all things, and because of that, Melkor introduced the first music of chaos, the same disharmonies that were responsible for all later evil in Arda. Well, obviously, eventually the will to exceed his creator's power turned Melkor into a vile and twisted image of himself, and as the sentient races of Arda began to emerge, his desire to conquer and overthrow contorted him into Morgoth, the entity responsible for the orcs, Ungoliant, and all the spiders, werewolves, balrogs, revenants, and the darkness in the hearts of men. This guy burned down world trees like it was going out of fashion. You see, it's hard to gauge just exactly where the veracity of Morgoth lies, because in the truest sense of the word, you cannot get more evil than Morgoth. And then, of course, there's the emergence of the cult of Melkor, headed by the lieutenant of evil himself, the Dark Lord Sauron, where here, as the high priest of that cult, Sauron orchestrated the human sacrifice of the Númenors in Melkor's name, and then pride cometh before the fall and all that. Morgoth, guys, he's got a mace called Grond that was literally forged from the essence of the underworld. I would not like to meet him in a tavern. Put it that way. Coming in at number 2, Randall THOR, the Wheel of Time. Alright, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently with this particular point, because by rights, in terms of power level, this guy should probably take the #1 spot on pretty much every literature list ever written. However, what sets this entry apart, as those of you who have read the Wheel of Time series will know, is that Randall THOR is kind of the good guy. I mean, he is the good guy. He's the personification of light and righteous flames, but he can also kind of destroy the fabric of all reality without breaking a sweat. The reason Randall THOR is ranking so high here on the terrifying meter is that if this guy was on the wrong side, we'd be donezo. I mean, it's a good thing that he wasn't or isn't. Rand is very clearly the main protagonist of Robert Jordan's phenomenal fantasy series, but guys, really, the Dragon Reborn would cover the entire earth in a blanket of cleansing fire in a single moment if he ever wished to do so. And that makes him terrifying. He's Superman meets Dr. Manhattan on a biblical scale. As written in Keeper of the Chronicles, he is born again. I feel him. The dragon takes his first breath on the slopes of Dragon Mount. He is coming. Light help us. Light help the world. He lies in the snow and cries like the thunder. He burns like the sun. I mean, I know he's good and he's going to save the day and everything, but that's terrifying, guys. Born in the year 978 of the New Earth, Rand is the most central of the 3 protagonists that make up the series, and really, guys, if you haven't, then Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series needs your attention. It's awesome, and it's with themes like this that gives it reason alone to stand out as such a remarkable work of literature. I'll try and avoid as many spoilers as possible, and this entry is kind of a spoiler alone, but if the thought of the root of all goodness and light in the world is also a source of unbridled terror and overwhelming fear, then yeah, this series is certainly for you. I'm just really glad that Rand is one of the good guys. Thanks. And finally, coming in at #1 spot, the crippled god, Malazan. And as so far as overwhelmingly powerful entities being the source of all of this terror, then we don't have to preface it with the willy or won't he ways of Randall THOR, because instead we can pin it all on one of the most potentially destructive forces ever found in fiction, the crippled god, the chained one, the death slayer, and the king of chains. Really, we'll try and do this one without spoilers, because Malazan Book of the Fallen is an absolutely astounding fantasy series, and if you haven't yet had a chance to check it out, then please check it out. And also, the audiobooks are really well done, so there's another reason too if you've got a long commute. Although there are a lot of characters to keep track of, so if that's not your kind of thing, actually no, just read it regardless. Anyway, the Malazan series encompasses many differing woven series featuring gods, immortals, alien entities, pretty much everything going. All of them though pale in comparison to the crippled god, and yet thankfully for everyone, this guy is chained and imprisoned, so he can't hurt anyone at all. I'm sure those chains will hold, right? You see, throughout the series, the crippled god often appears as a frail, bent figure, wrapped and hooded in rags and blankets, often inhabiting a dilapidated, sun-bleached tent found along a sandy beach upon an endless shore. Usually he is found huddled over a smoking brazier, speaking in a raspy voice intermingled by hacking coughs and laboured breathing. He has long tangled hair and all of his fingers and his thin mangled hands are broken and shattered. He weeps and moans in his constant agony, and he constantly throws seas into the brazier before him to further the wafting smoke that he emerges from. Really guys, I know it's quite a bit of a cop-out, but we can't get into the bulk of the crippled god without any spoilers. But if that initial appearance is curiosity enough to pique your interest, then believe me, as far as the crippled god is concerned, there is far more to be discovered, at your own risk, of course. The crippled god knows only suffering, and his only desire is to make all others feel the same. Well, there we have it, folks, our list for the top 5 most terrifying gods in literature. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Disagree? Have any more to add to this list? Then let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below, as well as any choice picks of your own. Before we depart from today's video though, let's first take a quick look at some of your more creative comments from over the past few days. First up, Brett Hazelton says, how does a Russian corpse from before 1855 know about atoms? Dude, Leucippus and Democritus were talking about atomic theory back in like 460 BC. Epicurus was blowing everyone's mind with the theorized collision of atoms, thought it was even cool. That's how atoms have been theorized to exist long before they actually were, which is an awesome fact regardless, so who knew, eh? Next up, Mark Rush says, too much talking. Guess I'll shut up then, Mark. And on that note, unfortunately that's all we've got time for in today's video. Should stick around all the way until the end. If you were a fan of this video, or just top 5 scary videos in general, then please be a dear and hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscribe button, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. As per usual, I've been your horror host, Jack FINCH. You've been watching top 5 scary videos, and until next time, you take it easy.